I think there are like three important issues that need to be solved before this COP ends. One is we need the rule book for the Paris Agreement to be finalized. So that we can actually implement the agreement, we need a lot of details and technical questions to be solved, and we need a clear commitment here that the parties of the agreement want to do that by 2018, and they're still negotiating about the timelines for that and how to do it and whether they really want to set themselves this clear deadline. The second point is that what we currently have as national climate targets is not sufficient. If you add up all the national climate targets, we would still see global warming of around 3 to 3.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. That's way too much. The Paris Agreement says we have to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. We have to aim for 1.5 degrees. So more needs to happen, and countries need to come back here with improved and revised targets by 2018. So from this COP, we need to see a clear call to all countries to come back with better targets in 2 years. And whether we will see that clear call is also still up in the air. And the last point is really about finance. Developing countries need additional financial support. This is a COP that's happening in Africa. In Africa particularly, many very vulnerable countries with very vulnerable populations need to see additional support for adapting to the impacts of climate change. And financing for adaptation is still falls short of what's needed, and this COP should send clear signals and see commitments from the developed countries to fill that gap. Well, Paris was a huge achievement because it brought the whole world together, and what we see here, what countries have reiterated in their statements in the last few days is they are committed to the agreement. We've had 10 countries ratify after the US elections, while this COP was ongoing, all saying we're joining the Paris Agreement, we want to be bound by the rules of the agreement. So there's clearly a global commitment to the agreement. Without the Paris Agreement, without the national targets that are part of the Paris Agreement, we would see more than 4 degrees of global warming. With the Paris, with the national goals that are part of Paris, we've brought that down to around 3 degrees. So Paris is already a huge achievement, but 3 degrees is unacceptable. It's catastrophic warming still, so we need to do more, and we need to use the mechanisms that are in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says every 5 years we will revise our targets, and the first moment to do that is 2018. We have to take that seriously and all come back here in 2018 and submit stronger national climate targets. So developed countries committed already in 2009 to provide by 2020 100 billion per year from private and public sources for climate finance mitigation and adaptation. And for years they weren't willing to tell us how to get to the 100 billion, how to a roadmap explaining how do we get from what we're currently providing as climate finance to 100 billion annually by 2020 and from which sources. They've now developed a roadmap, so there's a roadmap presented here by the developed countries, and that's welcome news. That gives us detail on how the 100 billion, how we will get there. But there are issues with this roadmap. Some of the numbers are based on assumptions that we don't share, methodologies, how private finance is counted. They count loans, so money that the recipient country will have to pay back eventually is also counted, so there are problems there. And the biggest problem really is adaptation finance. The roadmap says we're currently providing 10 billion, and we promise to double that by 2020. So doubling, also increasing adaptation finance, that's a welcome commitment, but it's simply not enough. That would get us to 20 billion. We assume that we need a balance of roughly 50-50 adaptation mitigation, so we would need to see at least 50 billion. We only have a promise of 20, so there's a huge gap. There are independent assessments that say the annual adaptation needs could be up to 300 billion or more. So between the 20 billion that are promised and the 300 billion that some say are needed, there's a huge gap, and we need to see a commitment here that adaptation finance will be increased even further. I think we could go long into the night, in the final night, because of the issue of adaptation finance. There's also another symbolically very important point there, that's the adaptation fund. Adaptation fund was actually created here in Marrakesh at the last COP that took place here. And it's currently it's part of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is coming to an end. The second commitment period ends in 2020, and developing countries want this fund that funds concrete, small-scale adaptation projects for the most vulnerable in the poorest countries to continue under the Paris Agreement. And there's still no consensus to take this decision here to say, of course this fund will play such a crucial role, will continue in the Paris climate architecture. So it's both about the fund, and it's about the volumes that will flow through that fund, through the Green Climate Fund, bilaterally. And I think we will need to see progress on both of these issues, or we would be up for a very long night and early morning potentially.